The sun had long since disappeared behind the horizon, and Charleston streets were bathed in the faint glow of streetlights. The city, once vibrant with the wealth of a thriving slave trade, now felt quieter, the air heavy with the memories of its dark past. It was in this shadowy world that the slave cabins stood, abandoned structures that were a lingering testament to an era filled with suffering and despair. Yet, it wasn't the buildings themselves that intrigued the people of Charleston, but rather the strange behavior of the animals that surrounded them. Local farmers, workers, and even the occasional tourist had all reported an unsettling phenomenon. Dogs, who were known for their unflinching loyalty and fearlessness, would refuse to approach the cabins. Horses, typically bold and unperturbed, would become skittish as they neared the area, prancing nervously and often pulling their riders away. The most bizarre reports came from those who noticed something even more unnerving. The rats, usually abundant in every nook and cranny, stayed far away from the cabins. It was as if something invisible held them back, some unseen force that pushed them away. One night, a local man named George, a retired fisherman, decided to investigate the site himself. He had heard the rumors for years, about the strange behavior of the animals and the whisperings of the locals, but he had always dismissed them as mere superstition. However, something gnawed at him that evening, a pull towards the site that he couldn't explain. As he walked down the overgrown path towards the cabins, he noted the absence of the usual sounds of the city, the distant hum of cars, the occasional call of a bird. The air around the cabins was heavy, thick with an eerie stillness. George had seen the cabins from a distance many times, but now, standing directly in front of one, he felt a peculiar sense of dread. The wooden structure was weathered, the roof sagging in places, and the windows boarded up, giving the place a look of long abandonment. A faint smell of mildew lingered in the air, a reminder of how time had worn down what was once a living, breathing space for generations of people. Curiously, George took a step forward, only to be stopped short by the sudden and unexplainable behavior of his dog, Buster. The golden retriever, a dog known for his calm temperament, began to whimper, his body stiff with fear. He backed away from the cabin, refusing to move closer despite George's gentle coaxing. Buster's eyes were wide, filled with a terror that George could not understand. Confused but undeterred, George attempted to enter the cabin itself. But just as his foot hovered above the threshold, he was gripped by an overwhelming sense of something dark, lying beyond the doorway. It wasn't fear, it was something more primal, an instinctual warning to turn back. Against his better judgment, George took another step. But before he could fully cross the threshold, Buster suddenly broke free from his leash, running in the opposite direction, dragging George behind him. It took all his strength to stop the dog, and even then, it was a struggle to regain control. The dog was frantic, pulling on the leash with an almost unnatural force. It was only when George finally managed to calm Buster down that he realized the animal's body was trembling, as if in the grip of a terror too deep to explain. Shaken but determined to find answers, George left the cabin and headed back to town. As he walked, he couldn't shake the sensation that something had followed him, that the air around him was charged with an unseen presence. The next morning, he couldn't help but share his experience with the locals at the bar. To his surprise, they didn't dismiss his story as mere superstition. In fact, it seemed as though everyone had a story of their own, all centering around those same cabins. One by one, people spoke of their own encounters with the strange behavior of the animals, and the whispers of something more sinister that lay beneath the surface of Charleston's history. There was old Martha, the widow who had lived in the house next to the cabins for over 30 years. She spoke of how her cat, a creature known for its curiosity, would often sit by the window, staring at the cabins for hours, its fur standing on end. Martha swore that the cat had once made a low growl that sounded more like a human voice than anything else. She believed that the cabin had a way of drawing in the animals, as if it had some sort of magnetic pull. But it wasn't just the animals that were affected. Another local, a young man named Aaron, recounted an incident when he had been walking with his dog along the path leading to the cabins. Aaron had been a skeptic, dismissing all the talk of spirits and curses as folklore. But one evening, he found himself at the edge of the cabins when his dog, a large German shepherd named Max, suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. Max's fur bristled, and he began to growl low in his throat, staring at the doorway of one of the cabins. As Aaron moved to pull Max away, the dog began to lunge forward, but not in the way Aaron had expected. It wasn't an attack, it was as if Max was trying to flee, running in the opposite direction as fast as he could. Max's behavior became erratic and violent. The dog began to snap at invisible objects in the air, as if something was attacking him from all sides. Aaron had never seen the dog like this, and in a panic, he had to physically restrain Max, pulling him away from the area. It wasn't until later, after he had returned home, that Aaron realized his wrist had been bruised by Max's teeth. The dog had almost bitten him in his struggle to escape. Even more unnerving was the fact that Max had no visible injuries, no marks from any attack. It was as though something had made the dog so terrified that it had turned on its owner. The unsettling behavior of the animals became more widespread. Farmers, who had long relied on their animals to guide them, found themselves increasingly wary of the cabins. Horses would balk at the sight of the place, refusing to go anywhere near it. Cattle would be found grazing in the opposite direction, as if they had been deliberately driven away. The unease surrounding the cabins began to spread through the town, until no one was willing to get too close. And yet, despite the fear, there was still a dark fascination with the sight, a compulsion to understand what lay within the cabins, to unravel the mystery that had eluded the people of Charleston for generations. But what was it about the cabins that caused such intense fear? Was it simply superstition, the lingering effects of a painful history, or was there something more insidious at work? The animals, after all, were not known to act this way for no reason. They had senses far more acute than those of humans, and their behavior suggested that they were picking up on something that the townspeople could not see. Something dark, something ancient, something that had never truly left the cabins. George, like many others, would eventually come to realize that the truth was far more complicated than he could have ever imagined. The cabins were not just empty structures, they were haunted by the spirits of the past, by the weight of untold suffering, and by something far darker that lingered in the shadows. Whatever it was, it had already begun to weave its way into the fabric of Charleston's history, and it was not about to let go anytime soon. Charleston, South Carolina, is a city that has always carried the weight of its past. It's a place where the echoes of history reverberate through cobblestone streets and antebellum mansions, where the grandeur of old-world architecture stands in stark contrast to the deep, dark secrets buried beneath the surface. As beautiful as the city is, it also exudes a kind of tension, a quiet sorrow that seems to linger in the air. This tension comes not only from the history that shaped Charleston but also from the way the city has attempted to move past it, often with more urgency than reverence. The city's charm is undeniable, its oak-lined streets draped in Spanish moss, the gentle lapping of the water against the battery, and the grandeur of its historic buildings. Charleston was once a proud hub of the Southern aristocracy, a city where wealth and culture flourished in the shade of towering mansions. But the city's prosperity was not built on the backs of noble families alone. It was, in large part, built on the brutal institution of slavery. Charleston was one of the most significant ports in the transatlantic slave trade, and its economy relied heavily on the forced labor of enslaved Africans. The cotton, rice, and indigo plantations that surrounded the city were powered by the labor of those who were owned, treated as property, and subjected to unimaginable cruelty. This contradiction between Charleston's beauty and its history is palpable in every corner of the city. Visitors who come to Charleston today may be drawn in by its picturesque streets, but if they dig deeper, they will inevitably encounter the ghosts of the past. It is impossible to walk through the city without encountering remnants of that darker history. Old churches, grand estates, and public squares all tell the stories of a time when the city was at its most affluent, but also at its most corrupt. The slave trade built Charleston into one of the wealthiest cities in America, and the descendants of those who once lived in those stately homes are still present, though they may not always speak of the blood-stained foundation on which their wealth was built. The city's historic district, with its charming row houses and lavish gardens, remains one of the most sought-after destinations for tourists. Yet, many of the places they visit were once the homes of those who profited off the backs of enslaved men, women, and children. The homes, now restored to their former glory, hide the darker truths of the past, as if the history of enslavement was something to be relegated to the shadows. Even the pristine gardens, with their manicured lawns and fragrant flowers, are often built upon burial grounds of the very people who helped sustain the fortunes of those who owned them. The irony is not lost on those who know the full history of the land. In Charleston's past, the story of slavery was not one that was openly discussed. It was buried beneath layers of polite society, tucked away in the halls of powerful families who benefited from the trade. Yet, over time, the story began to seep out, particularly after the Civil War and the abolition of slavery. But even as the city began to reckon with the brutal realities of its past, many of its residents preferred to focus on the preservation of its grand architecture and historic landmarks rather than confronting the human cost of that history. The city became a place where the past was both revered and conveniently forgotten. It was in this city, with its layers of grandeur and decay, that the slave cabins stood, isolated from the bustling streets of downtown Charleston. The cabins were located in a more remote area of the city, far enough from the historical district to be forgotten but close enough to remind those who knew of them of the brutal reality that had shaped the city's growth. To most people, these cabins were little more than relics of the past, forgotten structures that had long since outlived their purpose. But for those who knew their history, they were much more than that. They were symbols of the suffering endured by generations of enslaved people, standing as silent witnesses to the atrocities that had occurred in Charleston. Unlike the grand homes and churches that dotted the city, the slave cabins were simple structures, often little more than small, poorly constructed buildings made of wood and brick. They were not designed for comfort or even safety. Instead, they were built to house human beings like cattle, their primary function being to keep the enslaved laborers contained and under control. The cabins were dark, cramped, and poorly ventilated. They lacked windows or proper sanitation, and the conditions were often deplorable. They were built in close proximity to the fields, so the enslaved could be easily monitored and kept under constant supervision. These cabins, which once housed the families of enslaved people, now stood as broken, crumbling remnants of that painful era. Some of them had collapsed entirely, their decaying wood barely holding together. Others had been abandoned for years, their roofs caving in and their walls covered in mildew. Yet, despite their dilapidation, they remained a powerful symbol of Charleston's past. The cabins were not just physical structures, they were a testament to the suffering and resilience of those who had lived in them. They were a reminder of a time when the city had been built on the backs of the oppressed, and their legacy could not be so easily erased. For years, the cabins were ignored by the broader population. Few people knew of their existence, and even fewer cared. They were hidden away in the outskirts of Charleston, a forgotten piece of the city's history. But that began to change as more people started to take an interest in the city's past, particularly the painful history of slavery. As the civil rights movement gained momentum in the 20th century, there was a growing recognition of the need to preserve and acknowledge the history of African Americans, particularly in the South. The city began to confront its dark past, and the slave cabins, once abandoned and ignored, began to take on a new significance. Despite this renewed interest, the cabins still remained largely forgotten by the city at large. The local government was reluctant to invest in their preservation, and many in the community were more focused on maintaining the more prominent, historic structures that represented Charleston's wealth and status. But the cabins, with their eerie presence, had a way of drawing attention to themselves. As the animals began to behave strangely around the site, people started to wonder what lay beneath the surface of these abandoned structures. What secrets were hidden inside? What stories had been forgotten, buried in the dust of time? As Charleston grappled with its past, the cabins remained an uncomfortable reminder of the city's contradictions. They were a physical manifestation of the city's attempt to reconcile its beautiful, affluent exterior with the dark, painful history that lay beneath. And just as the city itself struggled to come to terms with its past, so too did the cabins remain shrouded in mystery, their secrets still waiting to be uncovered. For those who dared to venture near them, it was clear that there was more to the story than met the eye. The question remained, would Charleston ever truly confront the ghosts of its past, or would the city continue to hide its darkest secrets, buried beneath layers of history and decay? The slave cabins in Charleston, isolated from the vibrant city center and tucked away on the edges of sprawling plantations, held more than just the memory of their physical decay. They were the silent markers of lives lived in pain and silence. The enslaved families that had once called these cabins home had left behind nothing but the faintest trace of their existence. The cabins themselves, crude and worn, told no stories, but those who remembered, if only in whispers, knew that within their walls, history had unfolded in ways that had never been fully told. Among the families who had lived in these cabins was one that stood out in local folklore, a family whose matriarch had, over time, become a figure both feared and revered. Her name was Olina. She was an elderly woman when she was first brought to Charleston from Africa, her body worn by the brutal journey across the ocean, but her spirit was unbroken. Olina was known for her wisdom, passed down through generations, and for the deep, unsettling power she seemed to possess. She spoke little to others but was often seen with her eyes closed, muttering in languages few could understand, her hands raised to the sky as though calling to the spirits. Olina had once been a healer in her homeland, a spiritual leader who communed with the ancestors, and upon arriving in Charleston, she became a respected figure among the enslaved people. Though she had no official title, she was regarded as something akin to a spiritual guide for those who lived in the cabins. Her ability to see things others could not made her both a beacon of hope and a source of fear for the others. It was said that she could predict storms before they arrived, calm the sick with just a touch, and even predict the deaths of those around her. This uncanny ability to sense things that were beyond the reach of others earned her a reputation that became particularly important as the years wore on. The enslaved families who lived in the cabins were not just individuals who endured physical labor in the fields or lived under the constant threat of punishment. They were also spiritual beings, drawn from different cultures and faiths, forced to adapt to an environment that sought to strip them of their identities. The cabins, small and cramped as they were, became more than just places of rest after long hours of grueling work, they became sites of resistance and survival. Olina, for all her mysticism, understood the importance of these spaces as sanctuaries, places where the enslaved could cling to their beliefs, their histories, and their sense of self. Within those walls, the sense of community was forged, not just out of necessity, but out of the deep human need for connection in the face of unspeakable suffering. Yet, despite Olina's leadership and the strength of the families that lived in those cabins, an undercurrent of fear ran through the area. It was not just the harsh conditions of enslavement that caused this fear, it was something more intangible, something that lay deep within the very land itself. There were rumors that the land on which the cabins were built had been cursed, or that it was haunted by spirits who had been wronged in the past. Some said that Olina herself had placed a curse on the land, a final act of defiance against those who had wronged her and her people. Others whispered that the spirits of the ancestors had taken hold of the land, refusing to let it rest until justice was done. This fear was not unfounded. Strange things had begun happening in the cabins long before the end of Olina's life. There were reports of footsteps heard in the dead of night, when no one should have been walking. Others spoke of the sound of chains dragging across the wooden floors, though no one had been imprisoned in the cabins for years. And the animals, dogs, horses, even the occasional wild creature, seemed to avoid the area, unable or unwilling to approach the site. These strange occurrences, however subtle, began to accumulate over time, until they could no longer be dismissed as mere coincidence or the product of overactive imaginations. Olina's death was a turning point. It was not a peaceful passing, it was rumored that she died under strange circumstances. Some said it was an illness, others said it was the result of a curse she had unleashed. Regardless of the cause, her death marked the beginning of something darker. After she died, her body was never given a proper burial, instead, it was hastily interred in an unmarked grave near the cabins. The site of her burial was kept secret, known only to a few of the oldest members of the enslaved community, but rumors quickly spread that the land had become even more cursed after her death. Her spirit, they said, had not left the earth but had instead been trapped between two worlds, forever tied to the land where she had suffered and died. In the years following Olina's passing, the cabins began to show signs of decay. The buildings, once sturdy and practical, began to crumble under the weight of time. The roofs caved in, the walls sagged, and the floors became uneven. The once vibrant lives of the enslaved families who had lived in these cabins slowly faded into the background, overshadowed by the mystery of the strange happenings. The land itself seemed to resist the passage of time, as though it was unwilling to let go of the memories it held within its soil. The echoes of those who had lived and died there, of Olina and her people, lingered, unseen but deeply felt. For decades, the cabins stood forgotten by most, abandoned as the city of Charleston grew and changed. The land was no longer needed for farming, and the cabins became little more than a relic of a bygone era. Yet, the mystery surrounding them remained. The animals refused to cross the threshold of the cabins, and the locals continued to tell stories of strange occurrences, whispers in the night, the feeling of being watched, and the inexplicable sensation that something was lurking just beyond the reach of the visible world. The cabins, it seemed, had become more than just physical structures, they had become repositories for the pain and suffering of the past, haunted by the ghosts of the enslaved families who had once lived there. But it was not just the families that had lived in the cabins that made the site so unsettling. The land itself seemed to hold memories, both collective and individual, that could not be erased. The history of the enslaved people who had lived there, and of Olina's powerful presence, had left an indelible mark on the place. It was as if the cabins were not just structures but were themselves imbued with the energy of those who had suffered, fought, and resisted. They were not just a reflection of a painful history but an active, living part of it. The story of Olina and her family was far from over, it had simply faded into the background, waiting for someone to notice, to remember, and to uncover the truth of what had really happened in those dark cabins. The unsettling events, the strange behaviors of the animals, and the whispers of those who had lived nearby all pointed to the same thing: there was something buried deep within the land, something tied to the past that refused to be forgotten. The cabins may have been abandoned, but the memories of the enslaved families who had lived there remained as vivid as ever. The truth of their lives, their suffering, and their legacy was still waiting to be uncovered. And as the city of Charleston moved forward, leaving its darker history behind, the cabins stood as a stark reminder that some stories are never truly forgotten, they simply wait to be revealed. As the years passed, the once quiet and isolated cabins began to attract attention. It started subtly, with whispers that spread through the local community like wildfire. People began to speak of strange happenings, rumors that twisted through Charleston's tightly knit neighborhoods. The buildings, long abandoned and forgotten, seemed to pulse with an energy that unnerved even the most hardened souls. For those brave enough to approach, the cabins were not simply decaying structures, they were living entities, holding something ancient and unsettling within their rotting walls. It was not long before the first real signs of something otherworldly began to surface. The animals, once part of the everyday landscape of the city, began to exhibit behaviors that were beyond explanation. At first, it was the dogs. They were the most noticeable, as their instincts and keen senses often led them to places where humans had little business. A local farmer, whose dog was known for its intelligence and composure, was the first to notice the change. For weeks, his loyal border collie had refused to go near the cabins, even when coaxed with food or affection. Initially, the farmer chalked it up to the dog's fear of the dark or perhaps a fleeting unease, but it quickly became clear that something was not right. The dog's behavior grew progressively stranger. It would not simply avoid the cabins, it would physically recoil as if struck by an unseen force. The farmer, perplexed, decided to take his dog closer to the site, thinking that with enough patience, the animal would overcome whatever irrational fear had taken hold. However, as they neared the entrance of the cabin, the dog's response turned into a full-blown panic. It bolted away from him, dragging its master through the field, barking wildly as if something unseen was chasing them. It was only after the farmer stumbled and fell that the dog stopped, panting heavily, its body shaking uncontrollably, its eyes wide with terror. From that moment on, the dog refused to go anywhere near the cabins. Others began to notice similar behaviors in their pets. Cats, typically known for their independence and aloofness, began to hiss and back away when they approached the area. Horses, normally calm and steady, became jittery and uneasy. Some of the larger, more temperamental animals even became aggressive, rearing up on their hind legs and struggling to escape the influence of the cabins. It was as if the land itself repelled them, drawing from a deep, ancient source of fear that not even their natural instincts could counteract. And yet, despite their terror, the animals would not leave the area, lingering as if bound to the threshold, unable to cross into the realm of the cabins themselves. It wasn't just the animals that were affected. Those who ventured too close to the cabins began to report eerie experiences, each one more unsettling than the last. A local fisherman, who had lived in Charleston his entire life and had seen more than his fair share of strange occurrences, was the next to stumble upon something he couldn't explain. The man had been walking home from the docks one evening, when he decided to take a shortcut through the fields that led to the cabins. He had heard the stories, of course, but had always dismissed them as superstitions, old tales passed down through generations to scare children and the gullible. As he walked, the first thing that struck him was the absolute stillness in the air. The wind had died completely, and the usual rustling of the trees and distant sounds of the city seemed to have faded into a heavy silence. Even the birds had stopped singing, as though the very atmosphere had been suffocated by an unseen force. His footsteps echoed unnervingly in the quiet, each sound amplified by the silence that surrounded him. As he neared the cabin, he felt a strange tightening in his chest, an inexplicable sense of foreboding that seemed to come from the very ground beneath his feet. The sensation was not one he could rationalize, it was primal, a warning that his senses could not yet fully comprehend. When he finally reached the threshold of the cabin, the temperature dropped suddenly. The man's breath turned to mist before him, though it was a warm summer evening. He looked around, but there was no visible explanation for the chill. His skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, though there was no one in sight. He reached out to touch the cabin's rotting wood, but as his fingers brushed against the surface, he was overcome by a feeling of dread so intense that it nearly knocked the breath out of him. The air felt thick, like it was pushing against him from all sides, and his heart raced in his chest. He could hear a faint whispering in the wind, low and almost imperceptible, as if the earth itself was speaking in a language he couldn't understand. His hand recoiled, and in that moment, he knew he was no longer alone. With a sudden panic rising in his throat, the fisherman turned to flee, but his legs felt heavy, as though the ground itself was holding him back. For several moments, he stood frozen, unable to move, as if trapped in the very air around him. The whispering grew louder, the words indistinct but undeniably urgent. It was as though the land was alive, reaching out to him, beckoning him deeper into its dark history. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the pressure lifted. The whispering ceased, the temperature returned to normal, and the fisherman was able to move again. Without looking back, he ran from the cabins, never once stopping to catch his breath until he was safely within the familiar walls of his home. By now, the strange events surrounding the cabins were becoming impossible to ignore. Word spread quickly, and while many locals continued to dismiss the tales as nothing more than exaggerations, there were others who began to take the warnings more seriously. The animals' refusal to approach the cabins, the sudden shifts in temperature, the inexplicable sounds, all of these things began to accumulate, creating a sense of unease that settled over the town like a fog. Even those who had once been skeptical could not deny that something was deeply wrong. A few brave souls, motivated by curiosity or a desire to prove the skeptics wrong, ventured deeper into the heart of the mystery. Some carried with them cameras, hoping to capture some evidence of the strange happenings. Others sought out the counsel of spiritual leaders, hoping to find an explanation grounded in religious or metaphysical terms. But no matter what they tried, the truth remained elusive, as if the land itself was unwilling to reveal its secrets. The cabins, once abandoned and ignored, had become a focal point for something far greater than anyone could have anticipated. As the tales of these strange occurrences spread, they began to take on a life of their own. Some claimed that the cabins were haunted by the spirits of the enslaved families who had lived there, their pain and suffering so deeply etched into the land that it could not be erased. Others believed that the land itself was cursed, bound by an ancient force that had been awakened by the deaths and injustices that had occurred there. Whatever the cause, the mysteries surrounding the cabin seemed to deepen with each passing day, pulling those who dared to venture too close into a web of fear, unanswered questions, and dark curiosity. And still, the animals refused to approach the cabins. The fear they exhibited was palpable, as if something in the very air of that place had a hold on them. It was a fear that humans could not understand, a primal, instinctual terror that spoke to something beyond the physical realm. The dogs barked wildly but would not cross the threshold. The horses snorted in unease but shied away whenever they came too close. Even the rats, ever the scavengers, avoided the place as if they, too, understood that something there was best left untouched. As the mystery of the cabins deepened, it became clear that whatever was hidden within their decaying walls was something far more than the remnants of a painful history. It was a presence that defied explanation, a force that seemed to reach across time and space, wrapping itself around the land and the lives of those who dared to approach. The animals' refusal to cross the threshold was the first sign of something far darker, a sign that whatever lay within the cabins was not to be trifled with, and that some forces were best left undisturbed. As the eerie occurrences around the cabins grew more frequent and intense, the history of Charleston itself began to seep into the narrative, intertwining the present with the long-buried past. It wasn't long before locals started to recount stories of the land on which the cabins stood, stories passed down through generations, whispered in dark corners of the city's taverns, or muttered around the flickering flames of bonfires. The tales painted a haunting picture of the land's origins, one that spoke of suffering, bloodshed, and an unresolved legacy that stretched far beyond the slavery that had once been Charleston's economic foundation. Long before the cabins had been built to house the enslaved workers, the land had been considered sacred by the indigenous tribes that once inhabited the area. These tribes, now lost to history, had lived in Charleston for centuries, their lives intricately bound to the natural rhythms of the land. The very ground on which the cabins stood had been a place of worship, a sacred site where rituals were performed to honor the spirits of the earth and the ancestors who had passed. When European settlers arrived and began to claim the land for their own, they took no heed of these customs, disregarding the spiritual significance of the site in their pursuit of wealth and dominion. It was said that when the first settlers began to build upon this sacred land, the ground itself seemed to resist. Crops failed, livestock became sick, and families struggled with inexplicable misfortune. The settlers, unfamiliar with the land's deep spiritual ties, dismissed these events as nothing more than bad luck or the whims of nature. But those who had lived there before, the ones who had known the land's true power, understood that such disturbances were not mere coincidence. They were the consequence of violating something sacred. Some claimed that the settlers had angered the spirits that once inhabited the land, and in doing so, they had awakened forces beyond their understanding. As the plantation economy flourished and the demand for labor increased, enslaved people were brought to Charleston from Africa, the Caribbean, and other parts of the South. The cabins were constructed to house these workers, though they were not designed to provide comfort or safety. For the enslaved families, these small, crude structures became their homes, their places of refuge from the brutal work on the plantations and the ever-present threat of violence from their masters. Yet, despite the isolation and suffering, many found solace in their bonds with one another and in the spiritual practices that had been passed down through generations. Olena, the matriarch of one such family, had become a focal point for the enslaved people who lived in the cabins, offering guidance and protection through her deep connection to the spirit world. Olena, who had been brought to Charleston from Africa in the early 1800s, carried with her the traditions of her people, practices rooted in the belief that the world of the living and the world of the dead were not separate but intertwined. She was a healer, a spiritual leader, and a protector, someone whose strength and wisdom became a source of hope for those around her. But as the years passed, Olina's role shifted. The weight of the horrors she had witnessed, the endless cycle of suffering and death, began to take a toll on her spirit. Some believed that her connection to the spirit world had grown so strong that she could communicate with the dead, not only the spirits of her ancestors but also the souls of the enslaved who had died under terrible circumstances. And it was in the darkest hours of the night that Olina was said to have held secret rituals in the cabins, invoking the spirits of the land and seeking their protection. Over time, the rumors surrounding Olina's powers grew. The stories told of her ability to curse those who wronged her, of her knowledge of ancient rites that could summon the dead to exact revenge. Some whispered that she had made a pact with the spirits of the land, offering them her soul in exchange for the safety of her people. Others claimed that she had used the spirits to curse the land itself, ensuring that it would never forget the suffering of the enslaved. No matter the version of the story, one thing was clear: Olina's presence at the cabins had an undeniable influence on the land, and when she passed, it was as if the spirits had been unleashed, no longer tethered to the rituals she had conducted in secret. It was after her death that the first signs of true unrest began to manifest. Some of the elders in the community spoke of a powerful curse that Olina had placed on the land in her final days. They said that she had foreseen her death and had known that the spirits she had worked with would need to be protected. In the hours before her passing, Olina had performed a final, secret ritual, calling upon the ancestors to bind the land to her will. The result, according to these stories, was a curse that would bind those who dared to trespass on the land to the spirits of the enslaved, ensuring that no one would ever forget the crimes committed against them. The cabins, though seemingly abandoned for decades, began to take on a new significance in the minds of the people. The strange behavior of the animals and the reports of whispers in the night seemed to confirm what the elders had warned: the land was not empty, and it would not rest. It was as if Olina's presence, though gone from the physical world, had left an imprint on the very fabric of the land, a trace of energy that refused to dissipate. The spirits of those who had suffered in life were now said to walk the earth, restless and vengeful, their cries for justice echoing through the night air. These stories of the past, of Olina's power and the curse she had left behind, were not just tales told to scare children, they were an integral part of Charleston's legacy. As the years wore on, these stories became a part of the city's collective consciousness, passed down from one generation to the next. To some, the curse was simply a legend, a relic of a bygone era that had no place in the modern world. But to others, it was a reminder of the injustice and suffering that had taken place in Charleston, a city that had prospered on the backs of the enslaved. The question of whether the spirits that haunted the cabins were truly the result of Olina's curse or whether they were merely the product of collective fear was one that would linger in the minds of many for years to come. What was certain, however, was that the stories surrounding the cabins and the land they stood on had a profound impact on the people who lived nearby. The sense of dread that hung over the site seemed to draw people in, compelling them to confront something far deeper than the physical decay of the buildings. It was as if the land itself was demanding that its history be acknowledged, that the pain and suffering of the past be remembered. Even as the modern world encroached on the old neighborhoods of Charleston, the cabins stood as a silent reminder of what had been. The stories of Olina, the spirits, and the curse were no longer just whispered rumors, they had become part of the fabric of the city, woven into the collective memory of its people. And as the years passed, the truth of what had happened in those cabins, and the legacy of the enslaved families who had once lived there, remained as haunting and unresolved as ever. The past, it seemed, could never be fully buried. It would always find a way to resurface, demanding recognition, no matter how uncomfortable or unsettling that might be. As the strange happenings around the cabins persisted, Charleston's residents found themselves at a crossroads between acknowledging the growing sense of unease and continuing with their lives, as though nothing had changed. For many, the supernatural events surrounding the cabins were impossible to ignore, but they were also too uncomfortable to face directly. The city, steeped in the legacy of its past, was unwilling to confront the darker aspects of its history. The ghosts of the enslaved, the rumors of curses, and the whispers of spiritual unrest were things best left unspoken, swept under the rug of progress and modernity. In the face of these strange occurrences, the city's elite, including its religious leaders, were the first to dismiss the phenomena. Charleston, a city steeped in tradition and the fervor of Christianity, had long been a place where the line between religious faith and spiritual belief was sharply drawn. The people of Charleston, many of whom were descendants of the very families who had profited from the enslavement of African people, found it far easier to push aside the unsettling implications of the cabins and focus on their faith. For them, the presence of the supernatural was something that could be explained away by the lens of religion. If the cabins were haunted, they reasoned, it was not because of any lingering spiritual force tied to the enslaved people who had lived there, it was simply the work of evil spirits, demons, or the misguided influence of the devil. Religious leaders in Charleston, some of whom were descended from the same wealthy families that had built their fortunes on the backs of enslaved labor, saw the growing fear around the cabins as a threat to the carefully constructed narrative of the city's moral uprightness. Slavery, after all, was a system that had been justified by many using religious arguments. The belief that African people were somehow inferior and suited only for servitude had been rationalized through interpretations of the Bible. To acknowledge that the cabins might hold the spirits of those who had been oppressed, tortured, and murdered would open a floodgate of uncomfortable truths that many in Charleston were unwilling to face. Instead, the city's religious leaders began to downplay the mysterious events. They preached that the supernatural was a distraction, a fabrication of the mind, and that true believers had no need to fear the restless spirits of the past. They insisted that the proper course of action was prayer, spiritual cleansing, and a reaffirmation of faith in the Christian God. The stories of the cursed land, the strange behavior of the animals, and the inexplicable sounds were quickly dismissed as the work of imagination or, worse, temptation. The faithful were told that the best way to combat the growing fear was to strengthen their ties to religion, to turn their backs on the superstitions of the past and rely on the power of prayer and divine protection. For some, this approach provided comfort. The idea that the events surrounding the cabins were simply the work of malevolent forces meant that there was something tangible to fight against, something that could be defeated with the right kind of faith. Yet, for others, this explanation only deepened the mystery. If the land was cursed, as many suspected, then what did that say about the history that had unfolded there? How could a place that had been built on the suffering of so many be so easily dismissed as the work of mere superstition? These questions remained unspoken, as the city clung to its narrative of moral superiority, avoiding the deep, painful truths that lay just beneath the surface. In the face of this religious oppression, the stories of the enslaved families, particularly Olina's, began to fade into the background, overshadowed by the comforting narratives of salvation and divine order. Those who had once spoken of Olina's powers, of her connection to the spirits of the land, were now seen as outsiders, people who had allowed themselves to be led astray by false beliefs. Even within the African American community, many were torn between honoring the spiritual traditions passed down by their ancestors and conforming to the pressure to assimilate into the city's mainstream religious practices. The practice of spiritualism and ancestor worship, so deeply ingrained in the culture of the enslaved, was pushed aside in favor of the more acceptable Christian faith. Yet, despite the attempts to erase the memory of the past, the land itself refused to be forgotten. The cabins, though decaying and abandoned, continued to stand as a silent testament to the history that the city sought to bury. And as the years passed, the strange occurrences persisted. The animals continued to refuse to approach the cabins, and the stories of those who had ventured too close grew more unsettling. Some reported hearing footsteps in the dead of night, footsteps that echoed in the empty cabins as if the spirits of the past were still walking the earth. Others spoke of hearing whispers, barely audible but unmistakable, that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. The city's religious leaders continued to preach that the fear surrounding the cabins was a result of misplaced superstition. They urged their congregations to look away from the past and focus on the future, on the promise of salvation and redemption. But for some, the tension between the religious teachings and the strange events at the cabins became too great to ignore. It was clear that the land, with its cursed history and its connection to the suffering of the enslaved, held something far more complex than the simple explanation provided by the church. For many of the descendants of the enslaved people who had lived in the cabins, the refusal to confront the spiritual history of the site felt like a betrayal. They understood the deep connection that the land had to their ancestors, to the spirits that had been invoked by Olina and others to protect their people. The religious oppression that had taken root in the city seemed like a denial of the very essence of their heritage, a refusal to acknowledge the power that had once been held by their ancestors. To ignore the supernatural elements surrounding the cabins was, in a sense, to ignore the strength and resilience of the people who had suffered there. Over time, the religious suppression of the cabins became a kind of collective denial. The city moved forward, its residents continuing to build their lives on the foundations of progress, while the ghosts of the past were pushed ever further into the shadows. The cabins, though still standing, were forgotten, their significance relegated to myth and superstition. Yet, the land had not forgotten. The spirits that had been summoned by Olina and others continued to haunt the area, waiting for someone to acknowledge their presence, to give voice to the suffering that had occurred there. And as the years passed, the tension between denial and remembrance only grew. The city's refusal to face the truth of its past left a wound that would never fully heal. The spirits, and the legacy of the enslaved families who had lived in the cabins, remained a haunting presence in Charleston, waiting for the day when the city would finally confront the darkness that had been buried for so long. The silence, in the end, was not the absence of memory but the unwillingness to acknowledge it, an ongoing struggle between the comforting lies of religious faith and the painful truths that the land, and the spirits of those who had lived and died there, continued to whisper. As the strange events surrounding the cabins in Charleston persisted, the growing tension between the supernatural and rational explanations became increasingly apparent. While many of the city's residents continued to dismiss the rumors and unexplained occurrences as the product of superstition, others, particularly those from the intellectual and scientific community, began to seek rational explanations for the eerie happenings. The quiet whispers of a curse or haunted land were increasingly met with skepticism, as science, reason, and a more modern worldview began to take root in Charleston. Yet, despite their best efforts, those who attempted to explain the mysteries surrounding the cabins found that the deeper they dug, the more elusive the truth became. The first and most obvious explanations came in the form of psychological theories. Local doctors and psychiatrists, eager to apply the methods of their profession to what they perceived as mass hysteria, began to speculate that the strange occurrences were a result of collective delusion. They proposed that the fear surrounding the cabins was a product of the human mind, driven by years of trauma and the oppressive legacy of Charleston's history. For centuries, the city had been built upon the backs of enslaved people, and the scars of that history ran deep. The city's refusal to confront its past, coupled with the isolation of the cabins and their association with the long-forgotten memories of slavery, created a perfect breeding ground for psychological distress. According to these psychologists, the persistent reports of strange noises, the animals' refusal to approach the site, and the inexplicable feelings of dread that surrounded the area could all be attributed to the human mind's need to process trauma. The enslaved families who had lived in those cabins, and the generations that followed them, had endured an immense amount of suffering and hardship. It was only natural, these professionals argued, that the memories of such pain would linger in the collective consciousness, manifesting as supernatural occurrences. The mind, in its attempt to process and cope with historical trauma, had invented the stories of curses, spirits, and restless ghosts as a way of externalizing the grief and terror that had been repressed for so long. For a time, this explanation seemed to calm the anxieties of many. The idea that the strange happenings were a product of the human psyche, rather than an actual supernatural force, provided a sense of closure. After all, if the mind could create such phenomena, then surely it could also undo them. The city's residents were encouraged to face their past, to acknowledge the trauma of slavery, and to heal from it. Yet, as time passed, the scientific explanation began to unravel. The more people investigated, the more contradictions emerged. The strange events surrounding the cabins were not merely the result of psychological stress, they were too tangible, too consistent, and too eerie to be dismissed so easily. Another explanation, one that emerged in the wake of these initial psychological theories, was grounded in the field of environmental psychology. This theory posited that the land itself held some kind of residual energy, a kind of atmospheric imprint left by centuries of suffering. Charleston's land, particularly the area surrounding the cabins, had witnessed the suffering of the enslaved, the brutal realities of slavery, and the anguish of those forced to live in unimaginable conditions. The theory suggested that the emotional and physical trauma experienced by the enslaved families had left an indelible mark on the environment. Over time, this energy had become concentrated around the cabins, creating a place where negative emotions could be trapped, influencing both the people who lived nearby and the animals who ventured too close. According to this hypothesis, the strange occurrences, such as the animals' refusal to cross the threshold, the eerie whispers in the air, and the oppressive feeling of dread that seemed to hang over the site, were manifestations of this trapped emotional energy. The theory drew on the idea that the human mind and the environment were deeply interconnected, that places could absorb and reflect the emotions of those who inhabited them. In this case, the land surrounding the cabins had absorbed centuries of pain, sorrow, and rage, creating an atmosphere that was impossible to ignore. This theory seemed to offer a more scientific approach to the phenomena, and it gave those who were reluctant to embrace supernatural explanations something more tangible to grasp. However, even this explanation began to falter under scrutiny. While the concept of emotional energy being imprinted on the land was compelling, it did little to explain the more peculiar aspects of the events. Why, for instance, did the animals continue to avoid the cabins even after the surrounding land had been altered by development? Why did certain people report hearing specific voices or feeling physical sensations of pressure when they ventured too close? The environmental psychology theory seemed to offer some insight, but it didn't provide a comprehensive explanation for all of the strange occurrences that had been reported. As the scientific and rational explanations continued to struggle, a more speculative theory emerged, one that bridged the gap between reason and the supernatural. This theory posited that the cabins were built on a site of ancient significance, one that had been imbued with spiritual power long before the arrival of European settlers. This idea suggested that the land on which the cabins stood was not just haunted by the spirits of the enslaved, but that it had been a sacred site for centuries, perhaps even millennia, before it was disturbed by colonization. According to this hypothesis, the land had always been a place of spiritual energy, and when the cabins were built, this energy was awakened in ways that could not be explained by the rational mind. The theory of ancient spiritual significance was rooted in the belief that certain locations in the world, places of natural beauty or geographic power, were imbued with an energy that transcended time and culture. These sites, often associated with ancient civilizations or indigenous peoples, were thought to hold power that could influence the living, sometimes in ways that were beneficial, and other times in ways that were unsettling. The idea that the land in Charleston had once been a place of sacred importance, perhaps even a burial ground or a site of ancient ritual, gave weight to the more inexplicable events. It suggested that the strange happenings at the cabins were not merely the result of recent human actions or psychological trauma, but rather the manifestation of a deeper, older force that had always been present. This theory, though intriguing, also faced significant challenges. There was little concrete evidence to support the idea that the land had been sacred in any specific way, and many historians and archaeologists dismissed the notion as pure speculation. While it was true that the land had once been inhabited by indigenous peoples, the idea that it had maintained its spiritual significance through the centuries was difficult to prove. Furthermore, this theory raised unsettling questions about the nature of the land's power and the implications of disturbing such a site. If the cabins had been built on sacred ground, did that mean that the suffering of the enslaved people had somehow awakened the power of the land in a way that had never been intended? Despite the scientific and rational attempts to explain the strange occurrences, one undeniable truth remained: the mysteries of the cabins in Charleston defied easy answers. The more people tried to make sense of the phenomena, the more elusive the truth became. The rational explanations, no matter how well-intentioned, seemed to crumble when faced with the weight of the inexplicable. And as the years went on, those who lived in the shadow of the cabins were left with a difficult choice: either continue to deny the supernatural elements at play, or accept that some things could not be explained by science, no matter how hard they tried. In the end, the search for answers became a journey not just into the history of the cabins, but into the deeper, more uncharted realms of the human experience. Was the land truly cursed? Had it been spiritually awakened by centuries of suffering? Or was it simply a place where the pain of the past had left an indelible mark, too heavy for the human mind to fully comprehend? These questions remained unanswered, leaving the cabins as a haunting reminder that some mysteries are too deep, too tangled, and too complex to be solved with reason alone. As the strange occurrences surrounding the cabins continued to escalate, something peculiar began to happen within the community of Charleston. What had started as whispered rumors and cautious curiosity began to evolve into a profound sense of fear and uncertainty. Those who once ventured near the cabins, whether out of skepticism, curiosity, or the need for historical exploration, gradually stopped. The eerie atmosphere that seemed to pulse from the land itself was too unsettling to ignore, and the events surrounding the cabins became more difficult to explain away. Slowly, but surely, the area surrounding the cabins fell into a state of isolation, as if the land itself had become a place that no one wanted to revisit. At first, the isolation seemed like an unfortunate consequence of the growing fear that had taken root in the town. The animals' refusal to cross the cabin's threshold was one thing, but the creeping sense of dread that seemed to surround the area was far more difficult to ignore. People began to avoid the once bustling neighborhood that had once been a hub of life and work. The narrow dirt paths that once led to the cabins were soon overgrown with weeds, and the echoes of children playing in the streets grew quieter. Slowly, the life that had once filled the area began to drain away, and in its place stood a deep, unnerving silence. For many, the cabins had become symbols of a past too painful to confront, a reminder of the atrocities of slavery that had built Charleston's wealth and power. The cabins, which had once been home to families who worked the fields and lived in the shadow of their masters, now stood abandoned. Their rotting wood, broken windows, and sagging roofs served as a haunting metaphor for the broken lives and untold suffering that had unfolded there. It wasn't just the physical decay of the buildings that caused such discomfort, but the sense that something darker still lingered within their walls. Those who dared to venture close spoke of a heavy, oppressive atmosphere that seemed to emanate from the very soil beneath their feet. Even the most hardened souls, those who had lived through the trials of Charleston's turbulent history, found it difficult to shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting, or perhaps even reaching out to claim them. It was not long before the once thriving area around the cabins began to see a significant decline in its population. Families who had once lived and worked in the surrounding neighborhoods packed up their belongings and moved away, unable to bear the growing tension and the overwhelming sense of unease. Some sought refuge in other parts of the city, while others left Charleston entirely, unable to escape the haunting memories and the shadow of the cabins that seemed to follow them wherever they went. What had once been a close-knit community was now fragmented, each individual and family retreating into isolation as they attempted to escape the psychological grip of the cabins. As the years passed, the area surrounding the cabins grew increasingly abandoned. The homes and buildings that once lined the streets began to crumble and decay, their foundations sinking into the earth as nature slowly reclaimed them. Grass and vines overtook what had once been bustling pathways, and the quiet hum of the city's daily life gave way to a chilling silence. The isolation that had taken hold of the area was not merely physical, but emotional as well. The cabins became a forgotten relic, standing as an eerie reminder of a history too painful and too terrifying to acknowledge. This isolation became even more pronounced when attempts were made to investigate the area further. A few brave souls, curious historians, amateur investigators, and spiritualists, tried to explore the cabins, hoping to uncover some hidden truth or hidden clue that might shed light on the mystery. But each time, their efforts were met with failure. The first group to venture into the cabins was a team of local historians who believed that the buildings, despite their dilapidated condition, held valuable historical significance. They hoped to uncover details about the lives of the enslaved families who had lived there and to document the history of the cabins for future generations. The group's initial excitement quickly turned to unease as they explored the abandoned site. They reported hearing strange noises, creaking floors, whispers in the wind, and an unsettling sensation that they were being watched. As the hours passed, the group grew more and more uncomfortable. The historian in charge of the expedition, a man who had spent years studying the city's history, was the first to break down. He spoke of feeling a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread, as though something was pulling him into the depths of the cabin itself. He later admitted that he could not explain the sensation but could not shake the feeling that the land itself was somehow rejecting them. Despite their attempts to document the site, the group's efforts were thwarted at every turn. Photographs they had taken came out blurry and distorted, as if the camera itself had been corrupted by the energy of the place. The notebooks they had filled with observations were later found, their pages smudged and covered in inexplicable stains. The historian, unable to reconcile his professional experience with the inexplicable events they had witnessed, became increasingly disturbed and retreated from the investigation. He would later describe the experience as the most unsettling of his career, one that left him questioning not only the history of the cabins but the very nature of reality itself. Others who came after them met similar fates. Some claimed to have seen shadowy figures in the windows of the cabins, moving in and out of sight. Others reported feeling intense pressure in their chests, as though the very air around them had thickened, making it impossible to breathe. The most unnerving accounts, however, came from those who claimed to hear voices. These voices, they said, were faint at first, but grew louder and more insistent as they approached the cabins. The voices seemed to come from nowhere, as if the land itself was speaking. It was a sound unlike anything the visitors had ever heard, part cry, part whisper, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of centuries of suffering. Despite these chilling experiences, some persisted in trying to uncover the truth. However, as the years passed, the atmosphere around the cabins became increasingly oppressive, as though the land itself was pushing back against any further exploration. Those who attempted to stay overnight in the cabins were never heard from again, and the few who did make it through the night reported having nightmares so vivid that they could not distinguish between dream and reality. These disappearances and accounts of terrifying encounters became part of the larger, growing mythology surrounding the cabins, further cementing their place as a place of terror and mystery. As the years turned into decades, the cabins slowly faded into obscurity. Local officials, hesitant to confront the reality of what was happening, opted to abandon the site altogether. The area was eventually rezoned, and the remnants of the cabins were bulldozed, replaced by new construction and modern buildings. Yet even then, the land continued to hold an air of unspoken grief, as if it carried with it a memory of all that had happened there. The isolation that had taken root around the cabins was not simply a matter of distance or geography, it was a psychological distance that the city had imposed on itself. Charleston, in its refusal to confront the horrors of its past, had rendered the area into a forgotten space, a place marked by silence and decay. The gradual disappearance of the cabins and the continued retreat of the community reflected the emotional withdrawal from the painful history that had once been rooted there. Though the land was no longer marked by the physical presence of the cabins, the memories of the events that had transpired there lived on in the minds of those who had witnessed the mystery. The isolation and decline that overtook the area stood as a testament to a truth that Charleston had tried to forget, a reminder that some places, like the cabins, carry the weight of history in ways that cannot be erased. As time wore on, the site became a ghost, not of a structure, but of the collective silence that had allowed the pain of the past to fester unchallenged. And in the end, the cabins had vanished, but the legend of what had happened there remained. As the years passed and the physical remnants of the cabins were erased from the landscape of Charleston, the place where they once stood became a blank slate, a space where the shadows of history lingered, but where nothing seemed to remain. Yet, even though the cabins themselves had been bulldozed and the neighborhood redeveloped, the stories they held refused to fade. The legends surrounding the cabins, stories of strange sounds, inexplicable visions, and the whispered tales of an ancient curse, did not vanish with the structures themselves. Instead, they became something different, something more insidious, a quiet, lingering presence in the minds of the people of Charleston. The memory of what had transpired there became an unspoken weight, a part of the city's collective psyche, simmering beneath the surface, never fully addressed, yet never fully forgotten. For those who had witnessed the strange happenings, for those who had tried to unravel the mystery of the cabins, there was no closure. The mysteries remained unresolved, the questions still unanswered. What had truly caused the animals to avoid the site? What was behind the disturbing phenomena that seemed to plague those who ventured too close? What had been the real nature of the curse that so many had claimed was at the heart of the events? These questions gnawed at the edges of Charleston's consciousness, unanswered and unresolved, as the city moved on, focusing its energy on progress, expansion, and the future. Yet, in doing so, it was as if the past had been buried so deeply that it was no longer acknowledged, except in the quiet places, the dark corners of the city's memory, where the old stories and fears still lived. As time wore on, the people of Charleston sought to create a new identity for themselves, one that was free from the stain of their past. The city, now a thriving tourist hub, was eager to put the dark history of slavery behind it. The grand homes, the cobblestone streets, and the stately buildings of the historic district were polished and presented as the shining symbols of a modern, progressive city. The cabins, and the secrets they held, were nothing more than an embarrassing footnote in the history of a city determined to reinvent itself. But no matter how much Charleston tried to distance itself from its past, it could not escape the fact that its history had been built on the backs of the enslaved people who had once lived and worked in the very land that had given rise to the cabins. As for the descendants of those who had lived in the cabins, their connection to the land and its history remained deep and unbroken, though their voices were often muted or ignored in the rush to modernize. For some, the land where the cabins had stood remained a place of profound personal significance. It was not just a site of suffering and pain, but one of ancestral connection, a place that held the memories of their forebears who had lived there, worked there, and endured untold hardships. Even after the cabins were gone, their descendants still felt the presence of their ancestors, the weight of their history, and the sense that the land held something sacred that could not be erased by time or redevelopment. But for many of these descendants, the stories of the cabins had become part of a larger narrative, one that was not just about the physical cabins themselves, but about the very nature of Charleston's past, and the broader legacy of slavery that continued to shape the city and its people. The cabins had been a microcosm of something much larger, an enduring reminder of the injustices that had been committed and the violence that had been perpetrated in the name of wealth and power. In their absence, the unresolved mysteries of the cabins served as a mirror to the larger historical silence that continued to surround the legacies of slavery and oppression in the city. There were, of course, those who dismissed the legends surrounding the cabins as little more than ghost stories, tales spun from the imagination of a community that had been steeped in folklore and superstition for centuries.